Boone Calder first saw her at the hour when the desert lied. The day still held on in thin, stubborn strips of light, but the shadows had started their slow march from the cliffs, stretching long across the sage and broken stone. That was when the sound reached him. Scrape, drag, scrape again, steady as a bad thought you can't shake. He was up on the roof of the Red Mesa stage stop with a bucket of tar by his knee, pretending he was fixing a leak. Truth was, he'd learned to look busy when grown men were around. Out here, looking like you belonged somewhere could keep you fed. It could also keep you alive. Boone was just a boy, 14, thin as a fence rail, too old for excuses and too young for a gun that fit his hand right. Since his mother died and his father wandered off into the desert with a bottle and a promise he didn't keep, Boone had picked up two rules the hard way. Every quiet place in the territory has teeth, and the desert never tells the whole truth the first time you look at it. He paused mid-stroke, tar brush hovering over the shingles, and squinted down toward the dry wash below the ridge. That's where she came from. Not strolling, not running, hauling. A woman climbed out of the wash with a rope looped over her shoulder, dragging something long behind her. At first, Boone thought it was a log. Folks hauled timber any way they could, but it was too straight, too heavy, and the sound it made over the rocks wasn't wood on stone. It was worse. It was wood on stone with the stubbornness of something that refused to be left behind. The wind snapped her skirt around her legs and kicked dust into her hair. She kept her head down, boots digging in, one step at a time, like the hill was a personal insult she meant to answer. Her dress was plain, faded calico, mud-stained along the hem. Nothing about her said town. Nothing about her said protected. And then the light shifted, and Boone saw the side of her face. The skin there looked wrong, tight and pale, like fire had reached for her and missed the kill. A scar ran down from her temple toward her jaw, old and clean in a way that meant she'd lived with it long enough for it to stop being a fresh wound, but not long enough for the world to forget it. Boone's stomach tightened. He looked beyond her, out across the flats. Far away, barely more than silhouettes in the dust, a line of riders moved like they were trying not to be noticed. They weren't coming straight in, they were drifting, circling wide, like men circle something they think is already cornered. Boone's mouth went dry. He heard footsteps behind him, heavy boots on wood, and he didn't turn fast. You didn't spin quick around men who'd lived longer than you. Quick movements made folks nervous. A voice like boot leather and dry weather spoke right near his shoulder. "Boy, you planning on fixing that roof or writing poetry to it?" Boone glanced back. Jacob Morgan stood there with the late sun behind him, turning him into a hard shape. Broad shoulders, weathered coat, hat brim casting his eyes into shadow. The kind of man who looked like the land had carved him out of stubborn rock and left him half-finished. Jacob had stopped at Red Mesa before. Boone had watched them buy oats and salt without much talking, and ride out again like he didn't care whether anyone remembered his name. Folks said he ran cattle down south along Black Knife Arroyo. Folks also said he didn't go into dry water unless he had to. Boone lifted the tar brush and pointed down the slope because his voice had gone thin. "Mr. Morgan." Jacob followed Boone's gaze. The woman had reached the last rise now. She stopped long enough to spit into the dust, adjust the rope, and lean her weight forward again. Whatever she was dragging bumped against the stone and rolled just enough for Boone to see the corner of it. It wasn't a log. It was a coffin. Not a fancy one, no brass handles, no varnish, just rough boards nailed together by hands that didn't care if it looked decent. Boone thought he saw a crude mark carved on the lid, but he couldn't read it from that distance. Jacob's posture changed. Not surprise, not fear. Something else, like a man recognizing trouble the way ranchers recognize weather. He went down the roof steps without hurry, but with purpose. Boone followed, keeping back, trying to make himself small. The woman dragged the coffin into the stage stop yard and let the rope slide off her shoulder. The coffin hit the ground with a heavy thud that seemed to carry farther than it should have. Even the mule tied near the trough shifted its weight and snorted, uneasy. Jacob stopped a few paces away from her. He didn't reach for his gun, didn't raise his voice. He just let the silence sit between them like a drawn line. "Evening," Jacob said. The woman straightened, breathing hard. She didn't run, didn't call out for help. She just looked at him, chin lifted, eyes steady in a face that had seen uglier things than strangers. "Evening," she said back. Jacob nodded once toward the coffin. "You hauling your own dead?" The woman's gaze didn't flicker. "I'm hauling what's mine." Jacob's eyes moved over her like a man reads a ledger. Rope burn at her shoulder, mud on her boots, the set of her stance, balanced, ready. Her right hand stayed close to her skirt pocket, close enough Boone thought there might be a small pistol hidden there. Jacob's voice stayed low. "What's in there?" She glanced at the coffin like it was a private joke. "Tools, nails, some books, a Dutch oven if you must know, and a name I don't use anymore." Jacob's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but it faded quick. Boone looked back toward the flats. The riders were closer now, still wide, still testing, still watching. The woman followed Boone's glance without turning her head fully, like she didn't want to show her neck to the horizon. "They followed me from Drywater, not brave enough to come close, just brave enough to watch." Jacob's shoulders settled into a kind of quiet readiness. Who are they? Men who think a woman alone is an invitation. The words landed flat, like she'd said them before, like she was tired of them. Jacob looked at her, then past her, reading the empty space where threats like to hide. "You got a place you're going?" "I've got a claim," she said. "Up by Lantern Gulch." Boone felt his gut tighten at the name. Lantern Gulch was the kind of place people talked about in half voices when the fire burned low. A notch in the hills north of Red Mesa where the pines grew thicker and the old mine mouth yawned black. Prospectors went up there when they were desperate. They came back when they were lucky, if they came back at all. Folks swore they'd seen lights moving near the mine at night, lanterns drifting where no one should be. Jacob's eyes sharpened. That's a hard place to build. The woman's jaw set like she'd decided to stop apologizing for her own existence. "Hard is fine," she said. "Honest is harder." The riders on the flats shifted again, like they'd heard something they didn't like. Boone couldn't tell if they were coming or just making sure the fear stayed fresh. Jacob's gaze went to the coffin, then back to the woman's face. The wind tugged at his coat and dust rolled across the yard in a low sheet. For a moment, Boone thought Jacob might tell her to turn around. That would have been the sensible thing. Most men liked sensible. Instead, Jacob looked like he'd made a decision that didn't care about sensible. The woman's voice dropped, quieter now, raw in a way that didn't match her steady eyes. "I'm not pretty," she whispered, defensive, like she'd been forced to say it so many times that it had become a shield she raised before anyone could swing. The air went still for a beat. Even Boone stopped breathing. Jacob didn't flinch. He didn't soften his face into pity, and somehow that mattered more than kindness would have. He met her eyes straight. "That's fine," he said. "Pretty don't keep a roof up. Pretty don't stop a man with hunger in his eyes." His gaze flicked toward the riders, then back. "I need honest, not fancy." The woman blinked once. Something shifted across her face, surprise maybe, or suspicion at the shape of decency when it shows up where it shouldn't. Jacob nodded toward her, as if the next step was simple business. "What's your name?" "Clara Brennan." "Jacob Morgan." Boone watched the riders again. One of them edged forward, then held back, like a wolf testing whether the herd had a bull in it. Jacob didn't draw a weapon. He didn't shout. He simply stepped to Clara's side, close enough that anyone watching would understand what it meant. A quiet statement, a line in the dust. Clara didn't move away. She kept her chin up, scar visible, eyes hard as river stone. Boone stood near the hitching post with tar on his hands and fear buzzing in his chest, and he understood something with the sudden clarity of cold water. Whatever Clara Brennan had dragged out of Drywater inside that coffin wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was that she chose Lantern Gulch on purpose, and the desert, liar that it was already getting ready to show them what it kept buried. By morning, the riders were gone, but the desert still felt like it remembered them. Boone carried a tin cup of coffee out to the yard because the cook was busy cursing at the stove, and nobody else wanted to step into the cold. He found Jacob Morgan and Clara Brennan by the water trough, the rough coffin balanced on an old handcart like it belonged there. Jacob was reworking the rope with the calm hands of a man who tied down loads in bad weather. Clara kept both palms on the cart handles, jaw set, eyes forward, like if she let go, even for a moment, the world might take something from her. Boone tried to look useful, fiddling with tag he didn't need to touch, but Clara's gaze cut to him anyway. "You the roof poet?" she asked, dry as sun-baked dirt. Boone stiffened, and Jacob made a sound that might have been a chuckle if you didn't know better. Clara didn't smile, not really, but her eyes held a sharp kind of humor, the sort that didn't waste itself on comfort. Then her attention drifted to the flats beyond Red Mesa, as if she could still feel Drywater's eyes on her back. She spoke like she was naming a fact, not a complaint. Drywater's priest told folks I was cursed. Jacob didn't bother to argue theology. He only tightened the knot and said, "Priests say plenty. Don't make it true." Clara's shoulders tensed anyway. He didn't just say it, she replied. He enjoyed it. Boone didn't fully understand the difference until he heard it in her voice, the way a town can turn cruelty into a pastime and call it righteousness. Clara looked north, toward the broken hills and scattered pines. Lantern Gulch has a spring, she said. Cold water, steady. I bought the claim because a spring is a kind of promise. Jacob's eyes narrowed, the way they did when men watch the sky going the wrong color. Boone blurted the thing that had been scratching at him since last night. My pa said folks disappear up there. Jacob gave Boone a flat look, like fathers were not reliable sources, but Boone rushed on anyway. He said he saw lights in the mine at night, and he heard singing. That word did it. Clara's head turned fast. Singing? Boone swallowed. Could have been the wind. Jacob's voice came quiet and heavy. Wind don't carry lanterns. For a moment, Clara studied the empty country as if it were a person she didn't trust. Then she said, Men can be dealt with. Jacob asked her if she was sure, and she answered without flinching. She was already afraid, and it was easier to walk into fear than wait for it to find her. Boone didn't know whether that sounded brave or tired. Maybe out here, they were the same thing. They set out before the sun climbed high, Boone leading the mule team while the cart creaked under the coffin's weight. The stage stop shrank behind them, and the land opened up into a wide, quiet nothing that made every sound feel too loud. Clara walked beside the cart instead of riding, even when Jacob tilted his chin toward his saddle like the offer was obvious. Don't like being up high? He asked. Clara didn't even look at him. I like my feet where I can use them. Boone watched her boots grind into rock and thought, she wasn't stubborn for show. She was stubborn because it was the only way she knew to stay standing. The trail climbed. Scrub turned to stone. Stone turned to pines. Ravens watched from dead branches like they'd been assigned to keep count. Jacob's horse stomped and blew out a nervous breath as the air cooled and the hills closed in. The gulch itself felt narrow in a way that didn't match the map in Boone's head, like the land was pinching them into a place it could hold. Then Boone saw it, the old mine structure leaning into the hillside, timbers bleached gray, rails vanishing into a black mouth. A weather-warped sign hung above it, the carved name still readable even after years of sun and wind, Lantern Mine. Boone felt his throat go tight. He'd heard stories about that place, the kind told softly around fires, the kind that made boys behave for no reason they could explain. They didn't go in. Jacob dismounted and stepped close enough to the mine mouth to feel the dark without crossing into it. He stopped at the edge where daylight died, and Boone respected him for that. Men who walked into black holes to prove a point tended to become part of the whole. Clara stared at the entrance like it might blink back, and Boone heard something he wished he hadn't. Not singing, not exactly, more like a faint hum in the air, as if the mine were breathing through stone. Clara led them up a rise to the spring. It spilled clean water over rocks, bright and cold, steady as a heartbeat. Boone understood why she called it a promise. Further up was the cabin site, a flat patch of cleared ground with stumps and a view straight back toward the mine. Someone had been there before, scattered nails, a broken shovel, and a small pile of ash like the leftovers of a fire that had been put out too fast. Clara crouched and sifted the ash through her fingers, then stood, face going still. Jacob watched her carefully. You been here before? He said. Clara didn't deny it. I came once, at night, to see if the rumors were true. Boone stared at her like he was young enough to still believe fear could be avoided. Because I was already afraid, she said. It's easier to walk into it than wait for it to knock you down. Jacob's gaze stayed on the mine below, and Boone felt the gulch listening, patient as stone. Clara hadn't just bought land. She'd bought distance from dry water's tongue, yes, but she'd also bought trouble, the kind with lantern light, the kind that makes a place hum in the dark. And standing there by the spring with the mine watching from below, Boone realized something else too. The promise of water was real, but so were the teeth. Clara didn't waste daylight. By the second afternoon at Lantern Gulch, she had that rough coffin pried open like it was nothing more than a stubborn crate. The lid complained. Old nails, dry wood, the kind of creak that sounds like a secret being forced into the open. Boone stood a few steps back, pretending he was only curious about the tools, not the fact that a woman had dragged her whole life in a coffin across the desert like she was daring the world to laugh. Inside, there wasn't a body. There was order. A hammer wrapped for a smaller hand, a saw with a good edge, a square, a chisel, nails sorted into cloth pouches, a coil of twine, a folded blanket, and tucked in like something fragile, a small stack of books tied with string, corners scuffed, covers smoke-stained, like they'd survived more than weather. Clara lifted each thing out and laid it down with the care of a storekeeper counting inventory. Not rushed, not sentimental, just steady. Like she was proving to herself that what she'd carried was real and still hers. Jacob watched without commentary. He had the quiet, economical patience of a man who'd built fences in sleet and mended tack by moonlight. When he finally knelt beside the open coffin, he didn't smile, didn't praise. He simply looked at the tools the way a rancher looks at a well, measuring whether it's deep enough to trust. Boone tried to help, which mostly meant carrying boards and keeping his fingers out of the way. He'd learned quick that Clara didn't like pity, and Jacob didn't like questions, so Boone kept his mouth shut and his arms busy, hauling planks that felt heavier than they should have for a boy his size. The cabin footprint took shape the way the West always did, slow at first, then suddenly undeniable. Clara paced it out with twine and stakes, checking her measurements twice before she drove anything into the ground. Every line was straight, every corner chosen with intention. She'd picked the higher side of the slope where runoff wouldn't rot the foundation come spring melt. Boone didn't know much about building, but he knew enough to see she wasn't guessing. Jacob noticed too. Boone sighed in the way Jacob's eyes followed her stakes, the way his expression shifted, just a fraction, from skepticism to something like respect. They worked without much talk, the sound of the saw biting into pine, the clean tap of nails, the steady scrape of a plane. Sawdust drifted in the sun like pale smoke, and the gulch held the noise in its narrow throat, swallowing it before it could echo too far. By dusk, the light thinned, and the air turned sharp. The mind sat down the slope like a dark thought you couldn't shake. Boone tried not to stare at it, but the space where it waited seemed to pull his eyes the way a river pulls leaves. Clara made a small campfire from pine needles and stubbornness. When the first flame caught, it didn't leap. It crept, slow and patient, as if even the fire understood this was a place where you didn't waste yourself. They sat spaced around it, Jacob with his knife shaving kindling into tight curls, Clara with her dented pot, Boone with his hands out like he could warm fear out of his bones. Clara poured coffee and shoved the tin cup at Jacob like it was an offer and a challenge at the same time. "Drink," she said. "If you're swinging a hammer tomorrow, you'll need it." Jacob took a sip and grimaced. Strong enough to wake the dead. Clara's mouth tightened, almost a smile, but not quite. "Good," she said. "If the mind ghosts come visiting, we'll have something to offer them besides fear." Boone didn't laugh. He wasn't sure if it was a joke. The fire popped, and the sound made Boone flinch. Jacob didn't. Jacob's eyes slid once toward the mine and came back like he'd filed the darkness away for later. Then Jacob asked low and plain, "You got anyone coming for you, Clara Brennan?" Clara stared into the flames like they were showing her pictures she didn't want to see. "It depends what you mean by anyone." "Family," replied Jacob. "Friends." Clara's voice didn't change, but her fingers worried the edge of her sleeve. "I had a husband. He's dead." The words landed heavy. Boone could feel them settle into the cold ground between them. Jacob didn't press. He only nodded once, like he understood how a person could say something true without inviting questions. After a long stretch of quiet, Clara looked up at him, direct as a rifle sight. "Why are you here?" Jacob leaned back a little, stretched his legs toward the heat. "Because my south pasture dried up in July. Because your spring is steady. Because if you fail up here, dry water will come pick your bones clean and then come sniffing around mine next." Clara studied him like she was weighing a board for warping. "That's a lot of reasons to hide one." Jacob's jaw tightened. "And what reason do you think I'm hiding?" Clara didn't hesitate. Loneliness. That word hung in the air longer than smoke. Jacob stared into the fire, not angry, not offended, just still, as if he'd been handed a truth he hadn't expected anyone to notice. A man can be lonely in a house full of people. Learn that the expensive way. Clara's gaze drifted to his left hand. No ring, but a faint pale line where one had been. She didn't ask outright, but Boone saw recognition pass over her face. Jacob didn't offer a story. Not yet. He just let the silence hold what it needed to hold. Then he set his cup down like he'd made a decision that didn't need ceremony. Here's the truth of it. Winter's coming early. You need a roof and a door. I need that spring to keep my cattle alive. I'll help you build. You feed me when I'm here. Mend what needs mending. We keep it plain. Clara's eyes narrowed not at the offer, but at what came with it. And the town? Asked Jacob. Jacob's expression went flat. Dry water can choke on its own tongue. Clara nodded once. Equal say. Jacob nodded back. Equal say. She extended her hand across the firelight. Jacob took it. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't dramatic. It was a handshake between two people who knew winter didn't care about feelings. The fire cracked and threw a spark up into the night. Boone watched that tiny ember rise, grow bright for a heartbeat, and die. And then, down near the mine, Boone thought he saw something else. A flicker, a warm yellow wink in the dark, like a lantern being turned just enough to test whether anyone was watching. It moved, barely, then vanished behind rock. Boone blinked hard. Maybe it was his eyes. Maybe it was the wind playing tricks in a gulch that already felt wrong. Or maybe Lantern Gulch was reminding them that out here, contracts weren't made with words alone. Sometimes the land signed too. A week after Clara Brennan dragged that coffin into Red Mesa like she was hauling her own stubborn fate, Lantern Gulch started to look less like a rumor and more like a place where people might survive. The cabin walls had climbed from a hopeful outline in the dirt to something solid, waist-high logs fitted tight, corners squared, timber stacked in orderly piles. Jacob Morgan worked like a man who didn't waste motion. Clara worked like a woman who couldn't afford to. And Boone, 14 and hungry for purpose, ran between them, carrying boards, fetching nails, and trying not to stare too long at the mine down the slope. That mine sat there like a dark mouth that never quite closed. By day, it looked abandoned. Gray timbers, rusted rails, a sagging frame that leaned into the hillside like it was tired. But the gulch around it felt attentive, like the land was listening for the wrong kind of footsteps. Boone found the tracks first. He was stacking lumber along the high side of the cabin site when he noticed the prints cutting through pine needles and dry dirt. Not deer, not coyote. Boots, men's boots, and not just one pair. The prints circled the clearing in a wide loop, careful and deliberate, as if whoever made them didn't want to come close enough to leave a clear message, but wanted the message to be understood anyway. Boone crouched, heart thumping, and called Jacob over in a voice that tried to sound calm and failed. Jacob knelt in the dirt like he'd done it 1,000 times, tracking cattle, tracking thieves, tracking trouble. He studied the heel marks, the depth, the way the steps avoided loose gravel. Then he stood slowly, eyes narrowing toward the trees. 2 men, he said. After another beat, maybe 3, walking light. Clara stepped closer, her scar pale in the slanting afternoon light. Dry water? She asked. Jacob's gaze stayed on the dark line of pines. Could be worse. Boone wouldn't know what worse looked like, but he could feel it, like the cold that creeps in before the first real snow, before you can blame the weather. That evening, Jacob didn't ride out. He rolled his bedroll inside the half-built cabin and set it down without asking permission, like he decided the night didn't get to choose for them. Clara watched him do it with a face that didn't offer gratitude or protest, just a guarded acceptance, the way you accept a door latch when the wind rises. Inside, the cabin was still more frame than shelter. A tarp snapped overhead, tied down with rope that groaned under strain. A small fire burned low in a rough stone ring, throwing warm light across unfinished logs and scattered tools. Boone lay near the hearth with a blanket pulled to his chin, pretending he could sleep. He couldn't. The wind worried the tarp like it wanted in. The pines creaked, and the mine, though Boone couldn't see it from where he lay, felt present anyway, like a thought lodged behind the eyes. Sometime after midnight, Boone saw the glow. It wasn't moonlight, it wasn't a star. It was warm and yellow and moving, slow, steady, bobbing the way a lantern bobs when a man carries it over uneven ground. Boone sat up too fast and his blanket slid off his shoulder. Another light appeared behind the first, then a third. They moved across the hillside toward the mine in a deliberate line, not hurried, not lost. Men who walk like that weren't chasing anything. They were doing something they've done before. Boone leaned toward Jacob, whispering, "Mr. Morgan?" Jacob was already awake. He lifted one hand, palm out, not looking at Boone, just telling him to stay quiet. Clara sat up too, hair loose around her face, eyes fixed toward the darkness. Her hand went to her skirt pocket in a way Boone understood even without seeing the gun. The three of them listened. From the direction of the mine came a faint metallic clink, like iron striking iron. Then a murmur of voices, too distant to catch words, but close enough to raise the hair on Boone's arms. It didn't sound like ghosts. It sounded like men who didn't want to be found. Clara's jaw tightened. No, she agreed. Just men who want to be mistaken for them. Boone swallowed. What do we do? Jacob stared into the embers, and Boone could see the decision settle into him the same way it had settled when he stepped beside Clara back at Red Mesa. Simple, stubborn, and dangerous in its own calm. We finished the cabin, Jacob said. Roof, door, everything you need to hold through winter. He glanced toward the blank window gap, as if the darkness was a person sitting there. And we find out whose lanterns those are. Clara didn't soften, didn't thank him, didn't turn it into anything pretty. She only nodded once, slow, like she was agreeing to a fight she'd already paid for. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. The mine stayed quiet. The lantern stayed hidden. But in that unfinished cabin, with the tarp snapping overhead and the fire holding steady, Boone understood something that felt too old for a boy. The storm wasn't always weather. Sometimes it was people. And sometimes the only way through was to keep building anyway. Dry water never felt like a town so much as a set of teeth. Even before you saw the church steeple or the false front stores, you could feel it, how the place waited for someone to step wrong so it could bite down and call it righteousness. Lantern Gulch was quiet in a dangerous way, but dry water was loud in a silent way. The kind of silence that spreads when a crowd decides it wants a story more than it wants the truth. Jacob chose a Sunday for the supply run. He said it was the only day most men were sober enough to be predictable. Clara insisted on going anyway. I'm tired of hiding, she told him. Simple as that. Not brave in the way folks brag about later. Brave in the way you get when you're too tired to keep shrinking. Boone rode along on the wagon seat, shoulders tight, watching the land flatten out as they left the pines behind. The road to town felt longer on the way in. It always did. Like the dust itself knew what was waiting. Dry water came into view in the cold morning light. A handful of wooden buildings clustered around a church that leaned just a little, as if it had listened to too many confessions and started doubting its own balance. They arrived just as the service let out. That's when the street changed. People spilled from the church doors, laughing and talking, and then they saw Clara. The laughter died like someone had snuffed a lamp. Women pulled children close, hands tightening on small shoulders. Men paused on the boardwalks, not sure whether to stare or look away. Some faces held contempt, some held curiosity, and a few held something worse, interest dressed up like judgment. Clara walked beside Jacob down Main Street with her chin lifted and her scar uncovered. Jacob saw that scar catch the pale sun, bright as a line drawn on a map. It didn't make her look weak. It made her look like she'd survived something the town didn't want to picture. Jacob matched her pace, not crowding her, not letting the space between them widen either. He moved like a man who understood that sometimes your body makes a statement before your mouth ever does. They hadn't made it 10 steps before Preacher Whitmore appeared, as if he'd been waiting in the doorway of the world itself. He stood on the mercantile steps in his black coat, beard neat, eyes shining with the kind of certainty that never did anyone any favors. 3 church elders flanked him like fence posts, and beside them, leaning with casual confidence, was Amos Pritchard, merchant, boarding house owner, and the sort of man whose smile always looked practiced. "Brother Morgan," Whitmore called, loud enough to gather attention like flies to sugar. "This woman is known for sin. You defile her and yourself with this arrangement." Boone felt the crowd tighten around them. Not physically, not yet, but the air thickened. The trap started to close. Public accusation, social pressure, a test of whether Jacob would protect his name or his spine. Pritchard stepped forward next, hands open, as if he were offering charity instead of control. "Clara," he said smoothly, "my offer still stands. Honest work at my boarding house. Respectable work. Save both your reputations. End this." Clara didn't flinch. She didn't plead. She just looked at him with a steady disgust Boone didn't yet have the courage to show grown men. Whitmore's gaze moved between Jacob and Clara like he was already writing their sins into next Sunday's sermon. "A man like you should not—" Jacob cut in, voice even. "It's work." Those two words were meant to be a shield. You could see it. Jacob was trying to make the moment smaller, cleaner, safer. He was trying to step around scandal the way a rancher steps around the rattler. Careful, quick, pretending it was no big thing. "It's just work," he added. And then, as if to prove he had control of it, he said, "The cabin's nearly done." The street went still. And in that stillness, Clara went rigid beside him. Boone watched her face change, and it wasn't anger first. It was something colder, something like a door closing in a room you didn't know you'd entered. Pritchard's smile widened, hungry and triumphant. He turned his head slightly so the crowd could see the victory on his face. "There you have it," he said. "Even Morgan knows it's not worth defending." Clara didn't argue with him. That was the terrifying part. She didn't slap anyone, didn't shout, didn't cry. She simply turned, walked back to the wagon, and climbed up without a word. Her hands were steady on the rail. Her posture was steady. But Boone, watching her from behind, saw the tension in her shoulders like wire pulled tight. Jacob stayed in the street a beat too long, staring after her as if the sound of his own words had reached him late. He looked like a man who just watched something break and realized he'd been the one holding the rock. The preacher's mouth moved again, probably something about propriety, but Jacob didn't even hear him. He climbed onto the wagon seat beside Boone, gathered the reins, and drove them out of Drywater with the same quiet he'd used to drive nails into Clara's cabin walls. Only now his hands were too tight on the leather, as if he could choke the mistake back down into his throat. The ride home was long and silent. Clara sat in the back, turned slightly away, staring at the edge of the road like she could burn a hole through it. Snow began to drift again, light flakes catching on her coat sleeve. Winter didn't care about anyone's pride. Winter just kept coming. When Lantern Gulch came back into view, the unfinished cabin stood on its rise, like a promise that had gotten complicated. Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop. Clara climbed down first. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "Don't come back," she said, calm and final. "The cabin's finished. Our contract's done." Jacob opened his mouth, like he might argue, like he might finally say the right thing. But the words didn't come. Maybe they were too late. Maybe they'd always been too late. Clara reached the door he'd hung with his own hands. She stepped inside. From Boone's angle, he saw the wedge of warm interior light narrow as the door swung shut. Then it closed with a solid wooden thud. Not dramatic, not loud, just finished. Jacob sat on the wagon seat as fresh snow gathered on his hat brim. He stared at that closed door, face tightening in a way Boone would remember for a long time. Because for the first time, Jacob Morgan looked like he exactly understood what kind of man he'd been in that street, and exactly what it cost. A week went by after that trip to Drywater, and the weather didn't know what to do with itself. The sky kept threatening snow, then changing its mind at the last minute, like it wanted to remind Lantern Gulch who was in charge. Clara Brennan didn't wait for anyone. She worked alone now, moving through the cabin like a person trying not to feel her own thoughts. She patched gaps, straightened boards, set tools in order. Her hands stayed busy, because busy hands don't reach for hope, not when hope has a habit of turning sharp. Jacob Morgan didn't come back, not once. The cabin kept getting sturdier, and Clara kept getting quieter. Boone still climbed up from Red Mesa when he could, because he couldn't stop worrying, and because he couldn't stop watching that gulch either. It felt like the land was holding something in its throat. On the 8th day, Boone saw smoke. Not the thin, honest smoke from a cooking fire. This was low and careful, tucked down near the mine like somebody wanted it hidden. The kind of smoke you make when you're doing something you don't want daylight to bless. Boone didn't go straight to Clara. He didn't even step into the clearing. He slipped into the pines instead, quiet as a shadow, doing what boys learn to do when grown men start acting strange. Stay out of sight, stay alive, and keep your eyes open. The lantern mine sat there like it always had, Old timbers, rusted rails, black mouth. Only now Boone could smell it. Smoke and damp stone and something else, faint and sour, like old rot. He crouched behind a boulder and peeked. Men. Not miners with tired backs and honest hands. These men moved like they owned the dark. 4 of them, maybe 5. Lanterns held low, with the glass shaded. One man carried a coiled rope. Another dragged something heavy that left a fresh furrow in the dirt. Boone's stomach dropped when he recognized one of them, a ranch hand from Amos Pritchard's place. Boone had seen him in town, leaning on the boarding house rail like the world owed him comfort. Same belt, same hawk-nosed face. So it wasn't ghosts down here. It was Pritchard. Boone started to back away, slow, careful, trying not to make the brush whisper. His heel nudged a loose rock, just one little click against stone. Every man near the mine froze. A lantern swung, throwing sharp shadows across the timbers. Boone held his breath so hard his chest hurt. "Who's there?" someone snapped. Boone didn't wait to find out how good their eyes were. He ran. He tore through the pines, branches slapping his coat, lungs burning like he'd swallowed cold ash. Behind him, he heard boots crunching gravel, men shouting, the quick anger of hunters who just spotted a rabbit trying to pretend it wasn't prey. He burst into Clara's clearing like a thrown stone. Clara was at the stump, splitting kindling. The axe was raised, and she stopped mid-swing like she'd been carved out of the same wood. Boone bent over, gasping, "Mine! Men! Pritchard's!" Clara didn't panic. That was the first thing Boone noticed. Her face went still, and in that stillness, Boone saw something colder than fear. "How many?" she asked. 4, Boone said, then corrected himself because his brain couldn't hold steady. "Maybe 5, but once Pritchard's hand, I know him." Clara's gaze flicked toward the tree line, measuring distance, angles, choices. "Go inside," she ordered. "Bar the door." Boone hesitated, because boys always hesitate when they want to be brave and don't know how. "What about you?" Clara's voice stayed flat. "They want something. Men don't come up here for scenery." Boone ran inside, shoved a heavy wooden bar into place, and pressed his face to a crack in the door. Through that narrow slice, he watched Clara move. Not frantic, not confused, precise. She grabbed Jacob's spare hammer hanging by the doorway and tested the weight like she was choosing a language. Her hand touched the pistol hidden in her skirt pocket, confirming it was there. Then, strangest of all, she crossed to her trunk, pulled out a battered book, and slid it under a floorboard like it was more valuable than food. Boone didn't understand why until later. In the moment, it just made his throat tighten. People only hide what they're afraid will be taken. Clara stepped back outside and stood in the open clearing, alone, waiting. The men came out of the trees minutes later. 4 of them, rifles slung easy, faces pale in the thin light. The ranch hand Boone recognized walked in front, smiling like he'd come to collect a debt. "Afternoon, Clara," he called, too familiar. Clara didn't flinch at hearing her name in his mouth. "Afternoon." The man's smile widened. "Mr. Pritchard sends his regards, says you're stubborn." Clara's eyes didn't change. "Tell him I'm busy." The ranch hand chuckled and glanced at the cabin like it belonged to him already. Lantern Gulch is complicated. A woman alone can get hurt in a complicated place. Clara's voice stayed calm. "I'm not alone." They laughed, soft, ugly laughter, the kind men use when they think they've already won. The ranch hand stepped closer. "Where's Morgan? He tire of playing hero?" Clara didn't answer, and Boone felt a tension shift, because silence can be a yes, and men like that hear what they want. The ranch hand lifted a folded paper like it was a peace offering. "Here's the sensible part. You sign the claim over to Mr. Pritchard. You walk away. You can keep your cabin even. Mr. Pritchard ain't cruel. He just wants what's sensible." Clara's gaze flicked toward the mine for a half heartbeat, then back. "He wants my spring," she said. The ranch hand grinned. "He wants what's his." Clara's jaw tightened. "It's mine." The ranch hand's smile thinned. He took one more step and lowered his voice like he was sharing a private joke. "Then maybe we make it so you don't have hands to sign with." Boone's breath caught behind the door crack. Clara didn't raise her pistol. She didn't run. She shifted her feet, balanced, ready, like she had decided that if she was going to be frightened, it would be on her own terms. Then horseback sounded behind the men. All four turned. Jacob Morgan rode into the clearing like the land had sent him, rifle across his saddle, face unreadable. He pulled up beside Clara and dismounted, close enough to make a statement without touching her. He looked at Clara first. "You all right?" Clara didn't look at him. "They want my claim." Jacob nodded once, then turned to the men. His voice was quiet, plain, and final. "No." The ranch hand tried to laugh it off, but the sound didn't have its old confidence. "Town's behind Mr. Pritchard." Jacob's eyes stayed flat. "Town ain't here. I am." And Boone, watching through that crack, realized Jacob hadn't come back for a contract. He'd come back because he couldn't stomach the taste of his own cowardice any longer. In the clearing, the wind pushed through dead grass. The cabin stood behind Clara like a promise. The mine waited below like a secret. And for a moment, everything held perfectly still, right before the next thing broke. The first real snow came that night, and it came like the sky had been waiting for permission. At dusk, Lantern Gulch still looked the same. Raw logs, half-finished trim, tools tucked where Clara could find them in the dark. But when the light slipped behind the ridge, the air sharpened. Flakes began to drift down in slow, careless spirals, melting the moment they touched warm wood, then returning thicker as the temperature dropped. Jacob Morgan didn't argue with the weather. He got everyone inside. Boone watched Clara move around the cabin like she was trying to keep her hands busy enough to stop her mind from wandering. She set hard bread on the table. She stirred beans in a dented pot. She wiped the same patch of wood twice, then a third time, not because it needed it, because routine was something she could control. Jacob checked the seams around the window frame with the blunt patience of a man who'd slept through storms in worse places. He ran his fingers along the gaps, listening to the wind as if it were a language he'd learned young. Then he checked them again. Not nervous, practical, as if the cabin was a promise and he meant to keep it. Boone sat near the hearth, bowl in his hands, trying to make himself small. He could feel a storm building, but it wasn't just outside. The air between Jacob and Clara had a different kind of pressure in it, something unsaid pressing against the logs. Finally, Jacob spoke. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire. "I shouldn't have said what I said in town." Clara didn't look at him right away. When she did, her eyes were steady. "No," she answered. "Just that. No softness, no invitation." Jacob's jaw tightened. "I was trying to keep it simple." Clara let out a short, humorless breath. Simple for who? Jacob didn't have an answer that could survive the firelight, so he stared into the coals and let the silence hold the weight. Outside, snow began to hit the cabin walls harder, hissing as it melted against warmer logs. The wind rose and shoved at the door like it was testing the hinges. Boone flinched at the sound. Clara didn't. Jacob didn't. They were both too used to things trying to get in. Then Clara spoke again, softer, like the words escaped before she could stop them. "I used to read by firelight," she said, and for a moment Boone thought she meant right here, in this cabin, in this life. But the way her voice dipped told him she meant before. "Before," she added, and the words sounded like a place she couldn't go back to even if she wanted. Jacob stayed quiet, listening the way a man listens when he knows pushing will only break something. Clara stared into the coals, like she wanted to shoot the past and couldn't find where it lived. After a long moment, Jacob spoke again. "My wife died bringing a baby into the world." He didn't dress it up, no poetry, no sermon, just the fact. "She wanted town life, silk, people, music." He swallowed. "I wanted land and quiet." We both kept hoping the other would change. Clara watched him now, not softened, but paying attention. Jacob's voice lowered. "When she died," he stopped, and Boone felt the room tighten. "My first thought was relief." The word landed heavy, like a confession that didn't expect forgiveness. Clara didn't rush to comfort him. She didn't call him cruel. She just let the truth be what it was. Rough, human, and ugly in the way real things are. Outside, a gust slammed the cabin hard enough to rattle the shutters. Boone jumped. Clara stood abruptly like she needed movement to keep from cracking. "We should sleep," she said briskly. "Tomorrow we see what the storm left us." Bedrolls were laid out near the hearth, spaced with careful distance. Boone lay down, eyes open, listening to the wind worry the roof and the snow pile against the walls. The firelight painted the logs in slow, shifting shadows. Sometime in the night, Clara screamed. Boone jolted upright, heart hammering. Jacob was already moving, fast across the room, then stopping short, hands open and visible, like he was approaching something wounded and skittish. "Clara," he said steady and low, "You're here. You're safe." Clara was shaking violently, sweat on her brow despite the cold. Her eyes were wide, but not seeing the cabin. She was somewhere else, trapped in heat and smoke. "I can smell it, the oil, the smoke." "It's pine," he told her, "just wood." Clara's voice broke, thin and honest. "I hate that I'm still afraid. I hate that my body remembers what I want to forget." Jacob lowered himself to sit on the floor a few feet away, keeping the distance like a promise. "Bodies don't ask permission," he said quietly. "They just keep score." The words didn't fix anything, but Boone saw Clara's breathing slow just a little, like the truth, plain and unpretty, gave her something solid to hold. Outside, the storm kept howling through the gulch, and somewhere far down the slope, Boone thought he heard it again, that faint, low hum from the mine, almost like stones singing through itself. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe it was Lantern Gulch reminding them the night still had its own stories. Morning came clean and bright, the kind of bright that makes a bad night look like it never happened. The blizzard had blown itself out somewhere over the ridge, leaving Lantern Gulch buried under fresh snow that glittered like it was trying to be beautiful. Jacob Morgan stepped outside first. He didn't step out like a man enjoying the calm. He stepped out like a man checking if the world had left a knife on the porch. His boots sank with a soft crunch, and his breath turned to steam beneath his hat brim. He scanned the tree line, the slope, the silent mine scar below. Then he looked down and stopped cold. Boot prints ranged the cabin in the snow. Not one set, several. Some deep with weight, some lighter, all of them deliberate. Hoof prints, too, pressed hard into the crust. Whoever had been here had ridden in during the storm, circled close enough to look in the windows, then left again like they owned the night. Clara came up behind them and stared at the tracks without speaking. Her face didn't change much anymore, but something tightened around her eyes, an old familiar knowledge that privacy out here was mostly a story people told themselves. "They watched us," she said quietly. Jacob didn't deny it. He just walked the perimeter, rifle held low, following the ring like he could read the men's intentions in the depth of their heels. Inside, Boone tried to stay useful. He stacked kindling by the hearth, kept a fire fed, and watched Clara set her pistol on the table in plain reach, like she was done pretending danger needed permission to exist. The day crawled. No movement in the trees, no voices, just wind pushing loose powder along the ground in slow sheets, as if the land itself was trying to erase evidence. Near dusk, with the light draining out of the sky, the first shot came. The cabin jolted as a bullet slammed into the log above the window. Wood splintered and fell in sharp flakes. Boone yelped and hit the floor before he even thought about it. Jacob snapped, "Down!" His voice wasn't loud, but it was iron. Clara moved fast, not panicked, fast the way a person moves when they've made peace with what's coming. She slid to the far side of the window and peered through a narrow crack in the shutter without exposing her face. 4, maybe 5, using the trees. Another shot cracked, this one lower, striking near the doorframe and sending a puff of snow and bark dust into the air. Jacob's jaw clenched. He repositioned, bracing his rifle at a tight gap where he could return fire without giving them an easy target. Clara stayed crouched, revolver ready, listening to the rhythm outside like she could tell which man was breathing harder. Then the gunfire stopped. For a few seconds, there was only wind and the faint pop of the hearth. That silence was worse, because the men outside weren't leaving. They were thinking. A slow scrape began along the cabin wall, wood against wood, steady and close, traveling past the window and toward the door. Boone felt his stomach turn. It sounded like someone dragging something just to make sure the people inside could hear it. Clara's head turned sharply. Jacob leaned toward the wall, listening, and his expression tightened. "That's not just rope," muttered. The scrape stopped. A whisper followed, right outside the logs, close enough to feel like breath through cracks. "Clara." Boone's skin went cold. That wasn't a random threat. That was someone using her name like a hook. Clara's eyes flashed, fear, memory, and then something harder. She reached for the axe near the hearth and gripped it like she meant to answer the world in its own language. Jacob turned, alarmed flickering across his face. "What are you doing?" Clara didn't look at him. "Ending it," she said. Before Jacob could stop her, she yanked the door open. Cold air knifed inside. Snow swirled across the threshold. Clara stepped into the doorway and hurled the axe out into the snow with a heavy thud, burying the blade upright like a challenge. "Enough," she called into the trees. "If you want my claim, come take it with your hands, not your mouth." For one breath, nothing moved. Then a man stepped out from behind the pine with his rifle raised, confidence turning into exposure the moment he entered open ground. Jacob fired once. The man dropped into the snow, collapsing with the full weight of a body that believed its own luck. Somewhere outside, another man shouted, angry, panicked, suddenly aware this wasn't going to be easy. Clara backed into the cabin and pulled the door back toward her, breathing hard. Jacob stared at her like she lit a fuse with her bare hands. "You trying to get yourself killed?" he snapped. Clara's eyes blazed. "I'm trying not to live like prey." The answer hung there, raw and undeniable. Then the shooting started again, harder this time. Bullets thudded into logs, sending splinters flying. A round punched through a shutter gap with a high whine and buried itself in the far wall. Boone crawled under the table, hands clamped over his mouth, heart slamming like it wanted out. Jacob fired back in controlled bursts, never wasting a shot. Clara crouched beside Boone and leaned in close enough that he could smell pine smoke and cold wool. "Boone," she said, voice low and steady, "can you run?" He nodded, trembling. She pointed to the back corner where a loose floorboard met the wall. "There's a crawl space. It leads down the slope. If Jacob tells you to go, you go straight to Red Mesa. Tell them it's Pritchard's men. Tell them they've been using the mine." Boone swallowed hard. Jacob's voice barked across the room. "Now!" Boone didn't think. He tore up the board and wriggled into the darkness beneath the floor, elbows scraping wood, snow grit falling into his hair. He pushed forward through cramped space, breath loud, the gunfire above him muffled but constant. He popped out behind the cabin into knee-deep snow and gasped, sucking cold air like it might slice his lungs. He saw shapes moving among the trees, men repositioning, rifles in hand. One of them turned and spotted him. "Boy!" the man shouted, raising his gun. Boone ran. Downhill, slipping, falling, getting up again. Branches whipped his face, snow filled his boots. Behind them, the cabin kept cracking with gunfire, Jacob's steady shots answering the attackers' frantic ones. Boone didn't look back. He ran because Jacob told him to. He ran because Clara's voice had been too calm to ignore. And because Lantern Gulch had finally shown its teeth, sharp, human teeth. And Boone knew if he didn't reach Red Mesa, nobody would come in time. Boone Calder barely made it back to Red Mesa. He came out of the snow like something the storm had decided to spit up instead of swallow. Coat stiff with ice, cheeks raw, hair full of white. He stumbled into the stage stop yard and nearly folded in half at the water trough, hands slamming down on the rim just to keep himself standing. Men looked up from their chores. Somebody swore. Somebody dropped what they were holding and ran. Boone tried to speak, but all that came out at first was breath. Ragged, steaming, panicked. When the words finally broke loose, they came tangled and sharp. "Lantern Gulch, cabin, shots, Pritchard's men, mine." He pointed back toward the hills with an arm that shook like it might snap off. The cook rushed out, gripping a cast-iron frying pan as if a pan could argue with a rifle. Teamsters crowded close, asking questions too fast. Boone could barely hear them over the pounding in his own ears. Then Deputy Harlan stepped in from the boardwalk, badge crooked on his vest, winter coat buttoned wrong in his hurry. He took one look at Boone's face and didn't waste time on comfort. "Say it again," Harlan growled, voice slow. Boone swallowed hard, forced air into his lungs, and tried to make the story line up like fence posts. "They're firing on Jacob and Clara," he said. 4, maybe 5. They came during the storm. They circled the cabin. They're using the mine, Deputy. I saw him down there. One of them is Pritchard's hand. I know him." At the name, Harlan's expression turned the color of spoiled milk. "Pritchard," he muttered, like he'd been waiting years for that snake to show his belly. The stage stop yard snapped into motion. Not the clean, heroic kind you read about, the messy kind. Men yanked rifles from saddle scabbards. Someone checked a revolver cylinder with stiff fingers. Horses blew steam and shifted nervously as saddles were thrown on too fast. Nobody looked brave. They looked tired and angry and scared of being too late. Harlan swung up into the saddle with a grunt that sounded like pain, then reached down and hauled Boone up behind him. Boone clung to the deputy's belt, knuckles white, legs barely strong enough to hold on. They rode out hard. Hooves punched through crusted snow and slush. Icy clumps flew up and fell heavy again. The wind cut sideways and Boone's eyes watered until he could barely see, but he kept staring toward the hills anyway, as if watching hard enough could pull Jacob and Clara out of danger. When they crested the ridge above Lantern Gulch, Boone's stomach dropped. Smoke curled into the pale sky. For one sick moment, Boone thought the cabin was burning. Then he saw it clearly. The cabin stood, dark wood against white snow, scarred but upright. The smoke was lower, down at the mine. The lantern mine was breathing gray. Harlan swore under his breath. "They're trying to cover something," he said, and Boone knew he was right before he even understood why. They rode down fast, then slowed down as they entered the clearing, because fast gets you killed when rifles are still out. Jacob and Clara were outside the cabin, backs near the wall like they'd been holding the line for hours. Jacob's sleeve was soaked dark with blood. Clara's face was streaked with soot, her pistol still in her hand like it belonged there. Both of them looked exhausted in the way people look after they survived something they didn't get to choose. Boone met Clara's eyes for half a second. Something eased in her expression. Relief, quick and controlled, then vanished behind resolve. Jacob gave Boone the smallest nod. "Good boy," Jacob said, voice rough. Harlan reined in hard. "Where are they?" he demanded. Jacob jerked his chin toward the smoke. "Ran for the mine when they realized they couldn't scare us out." Clara added, flat as stone. "They lit it. They set a fire inside." That's when Boone saw the mine mouth clearly. Smoke pouring out thick, heavy, wrong. Men don't light a mine on accident, not unless they want the whole mountain to forget what it saw. Harlan motioned his posse forward. They approached the entrance in a cautious line, scarves pulled over their faces, rifles ready. The smoke stung Boone's eyes even from a distance. It smelled of damp stone and burning timber, and something sharper under it, like chemicals or rotten sweetness. Harlan stopped short and squinted into the gray. "Why burn a mine?" he muttered. Jacob didn't answer immediately. He glanced at Clara and his voice came out tight. "There's another way in, a second tunnel." Harlan turned on Clara. "How do you know that?" Clara's eyes didn't flinch. "Because I came here once. At night. I followed the lanterns." The deputy looked like he wanted to argue, but the smoke thickened, and from inside the mine came a low groan. Timber straining, something shifting deep in the dark. Jacob pointed toward the east slope. "We go around. If there's another tunnel, they might be hiding something, or someone." They split up. Some men stayed at the mine mouth to keep it watched. Harlan, Jacob, Clara, and Boone went along the east side through snow-laden brush. The ground was slick under the crust, and Boone nearly went down twice before Jacob caught him by the collar and shoved him upright without slowing. They found it half hidden by scrub and rock, a narrow entrance that looked like it had been meant to disappear. Fresh tracks led in, drag marks too, cutting through the snow like someone had hauled heavy loads again and again. Clara stared at the entrance, face pale. "This wasn't for ore," she said quietly. Harlan raised his lantern and stepped inside. The light painted damp stone walls and timber supports that sweated moisture. The air was stale, heavy with old rot, and Boone's stomach turned as if his body knew it shouldn't be breathing there. A few steps in, the lantern light caught stacked crates. Not mining tools, not supplies. Crates full of bottles. Some were wrapped in straw, some were broken, and the glass inside glinted darkly. Boone didn't need labels to understand. He'd heard whispers about opium on the frontier, how it slipped through towns like poison, how it bought men's silence and ruined men's wages. Harlan's face hardened into something grim and official. "Smuggling," he breathed. He searched the crates, then found a ledger shoved behind them, worn cover, inked pages. He opened it under lantern light, scanning lines with growing fury. Boone couldn't read the names from where he stood, but he didn't need to. He saw the way Harlan's hands tightened. His jaw worked as if he were chewing nails. Clara's voice came out low. "That's why the town believed the preacher," she said. "He wasn't just preaching, he was selling righteousness and buying silence." A sound echoed from deeper in the tunnel. Footsteps. Everyone went still. Jacob lifted his rifle in one clean motion. Harlan shifted his stance, revolver ready. Boone's heart hammered so hard he thought the men would hear it. A figure stumbled into the lantern glow. Preacher Whitmore. His black coat was smeared with soot, collar crooked, hair damp with sweat. He didn't look holy now. He He looked like a man who'd been caught doing something ugly and didn't know which lie would save him. When he saw them, his mouth opened and a plea spilled out instead of scripture. "You don't understand. This town, this territory, it needs order." Harlan's voice was ice. "It needs law." Whitmore's gaze snapped at Clara, and Boone felt something ugly pass over the preacher's face. Blame, obsession, the need to make her the devil so he didn't have to look at his own hands. Clara met his eyes without flinching. "You wanted a devil," she said softly, "so you made one." Whitmore lunged. He moved fast, desperate, boots scraping on wet rock. For one heartbeat, Boone thought he might reach Clara, that the darkness might take one more thing. Jacob fired once. The shot cracked inside the tunnel like thunder trapped in stone. Smoke and powder flashed in the lantern light. Whitmore dropped hard, crying out, wounded and furious, and suddenly very human. Harlan was on him in an instant, binding his wrists with rope pulled tight. Whitmore's breath came in broken gasps, and the lantern flame trembled as if even it wanted to look away. Then the mine groaned again, louder this time. Dust shook from the ceiling. A timber support complained like a dying animal. The fire inside the main mine had reached something deep, and the mountain was deciding if it wanted to keep standing. "Out!" Harlan barked. They ran. They burst into blinding snow light as the lantern mine collapsed inward with a deep shaking roar. The ground shivered. A plume of gray dust and smoke billowed up over the white slopes like the mountain exhaling its last secret. Boone stood panting, staring at the sinking mouth of the mine. No lanterns would move there now. No humming. Just silence and ruin. Near the mine entrance, Amos Pritchard was dragged forward in cuffs, his fine coat dusted with soot, his clean smile gone. He shouted about reputation and property until Harlan shoved him hard enough to steal the breath from his lungs. When it was done, when the prisoners were tied and the posse began the long ride back, Jacob and Clara stood beside their battered cabin, smoke thinning behind them, snow falling light again. They didn't look triumphant. They looked like people who held something together through the worst kind of storm, one made of men. Boone Calder barely made it back to Red Mesa. He came out of the snow like something the storm had decided to spit up instead of swallow. Coat stiff with ice, cheeks raw, hair full of white. He stumbled into the stage stop yard and nearly folded in half at the water trough, hands slamming down on the rim just to keep himself standing. Men looked up from their chores. Somebody swore. Somebody dropped what they were holding and ran. Boone tried to speak, but all that came out at first was breath. Ragged, steaming, panicked. When the words finally broke loose, they came tangled and sharp. "Lantern Gulch, cabin, shots, Pritchard's men, mine." He pointed back toward the hills with an arm that shook like it might snap off. The cook rushed out, gripping a cast-iron frying pan as if a pan could argue with a rifle. Teamsters crowded close, asking questions too fast. Boone could barely hear them over the pounding in his own ears. Then Deputy Harlan stepped in from the boardwalk, badge crooked on his vest, winter coat buttoned wrong in his hurry. He took one look at Boone's face and didn't waste time on comfort. "Say it again," Harlan growled, voice slow. Boone swallowed hard, forced air into his lungs, and tried to make the story line up like fence posts. "They're firing on Jacob and Clara," he said. 4, maybe 5. They came during the storm. They circled the cabin. They're using the mine, Deputy. I saw him down there. One of them is Pritchard's hand. I know him." At the name, Harlan's expression turned the color of spoiled milk. "Pritchard," he muttered, like he'd been waiting years for that snake to show his belly. The stage stop yard snapped into motion. Not the clean, heroic kind you read about, the messy kind. Men yanked rifles from saddle scabbards. Someone checked a revolver cylinder with stiff fingers. Horses blew steam and shifted nervously as saddles were thrown on too fast. Nobody looked brave. They looked tired and angry and scared of being too late. Harlan swung up into the saddle with a grunt that sounded like pain, then reached down and hauled Boone up behind him. Boone clung to the deputy's belt, knuckles white, legs barely strong enough to hold on. They rode out hard. Hooves punched through crusted snow and slush. Icy clumps flew up and fell heavy again. The wind cut sideways and Boone's eyes watered until he could barely see, but he kept staring toward the hills anyway, as if watching hard enough could pull Jacob and Clara out of danger. When they crested the ridge above Lantern Gulch, Boone's stomach dropped. Smoke curled into the pale sky. For one sick moment, Boone thought the cabin was burning. Then he saw it clearly. The cabin stood, dark wood against white snow, scarred but upright. The smoke was lower, down at the mine. The lantern mine was breathing gray. Harlan swore under his breath. "They're trying to cover something," he said, and Boone knew he was right before he even understood why. They rode down fast, then slowed down as they entered the clearing, because fast gets you killed when rifles are still out. Jacob and Clara were outside the cabin, backs near the wall like they'd been holding the line for hours. Jacob's sleeve was soaked dark with blood. Clara's face was streaked with soot, her pistol still in her hand like it belonged there. Both of them looked exhausted in the way people look after they survived something they didn't get to choose. Boone met Clara's eyes for half a second. Something eased in her expression. Relief, quick and controlled, then vanished behind resolve. Jacob gave Boone the smallest nod. "Good boy," Jacob said, voice rough. Harlan reined in hard. "Where are they?" he demanded. Jacob jerked his chin toward the smoke. "Ran for the mine when they realized they couldn't scare us out." Clara added, flat as stone. "They lit it. They set a fire inside." That's when Boone saw the mine mouth clearly. Smoke pouring out thick, heavy, wrong. Men don't light a mine on accident, not unless they want the whole mountain to forget what it saw. Harlan motioned his posse forward. They approached the entrance in a cautious line, scarves pulled over their faces, rifles ready. The smoke stung Boone's eyes even from a distance. It smelled of damp stone and burning timber, and something sharper under it, like chemicals or rotten sweetness. Harlan stopped short and squinted into the gray. "Why burn a mine?" he muttered. Jacob didn't answer immediately. He glanced at Clara and his voice came out tight. "There's another way in, a second tunnel." Harlan turned on Clara. "How do you know that?" Clara's eyes didn't flinch. "Because I came here once, at night. I followed the lanterns." The deputy looked like he wanted to argue, but the smoke thickened, and from inside the mine came a low groan. Timber straining, something shifting deep in the dark. Jacob pointed toward the east slope. "We go around. If there's another tunnel, they might be hiding something, or someone." They split up. Some men stayed at the mine mouth to keep it watched. Harlan, Jacob, Clara, and Boone went along the east side through snow-laden brush. The ground was slick under the crust, and Boone nearly went down twice before Jacob caught him by the collar and shoved him upright without slowing. They found it half hidden by scrub and rock, a narrow entrance that looked like it had been meant to disappear. Fresh tracks led in, drag marks too, cutting through the snow like someone had hauled heavy loads again and again. Clara stared at the entrance, face pale. "This wasn't for ore," she said quietly. Harlan raised his lantern and stepped inside. The light painted damp stone walls and timber supports that sweated moisture. The air was stale, heavy with old rot, and Boone's stomach turned as if his body knew it shouldn't be breathing there. A few steps in, the lantern light caught stacked crates. Not mining tools, not supplies. Crates full of bottles. Some were wrapped in straw, some were broken, and the glass inside glinted darkly. Boone didn't need labels to understand. He'd heard whispers about opium on the frontier, how it slipped through towns like poison, how it bought men's silence and ruined men's wages. Harlan's face hardened into something grim and official. "Smuggling," he breathed. He searched the crates, then found a ledger shoved behind them, worn cover, inked pages. He opened it under lantern light, scanning lines with growing fury. Boone couldn't read the names from where he stood, but he didn't need to. He saw the way Harlan's hands tightened. His jaw worked as if he were chewing nails. Clara's voice came out low. "That's why the town believed the preacher," she said. "He wasn't just preaching, he was selling righteousness and buying silence." A sound echoed from deeper in the tunnel. Footsteps. Everyone went still. Jacob lifted his rifle in one clean motion. Harlan shifted his stance, revolver ready. Boone's heart hammered so hard he thought the men would hear it. A figure stumbled into the lantern glow. Preacher Whitmore. His black coat was smeared with soot, collar crooked, hair damp with sweat. He didn't look holy now. He looked like a man who'd been caught doing something ugly and didn't know which lie would save him. When he saw them, his mouth opened and a plea spilled out instead of scripture. "You don't understand. This town, this territory, it needs order." Harlan's voice was ice. "It needs law." Whitmore's gaze snapped at Clara, and Boone felt something ugly pass over the preacher's face. Blame, obsession, the need to make her the devil so he didn't have to look at his own hands. Clara met his eyes without flinching. "You wanted a devil," she said softly, "so you made one." Whitmore lunged. He moved fast, desperate, boots scraping on wet rock. For one heartbeat, Boone thought he might reach Clara, that the darkness might take one more thing. Jacob fired once. The shot cracked inside the tunnel like thunder trapped in stone. Smoke and powder flashed in the lantern light. Whitmore dropped hard, crying out, wounded and furious, and suddenly very human. Harlan was on him in an instant, binding his wrists with rope pulled tight. Whitmore's breath came in broken gasps, and the lantern flame trembled as if even it wanted to look away. Then the mine groaned again, louder this time. Dust shook from the ceiling. A timber support complained like a dying animal. The fire inside the main mine had reached something deep, and the mountain was deciding if it wanted to keep standing. "Out!" Harlan barked. They ran. They burst into blinding snow light as the lantern mine collapsed inward with a deep shaking roar. The ground shivered. A plume of gray dust and smoke billowed up over the white